So I'm going to go ahead and start. If anybody wants coffee, this class is not going to be as long as normal, unless you guys want to talk. I'm willing to talk. I got into town at 5 this morning from West Virginia, seeing my folks in West Virginia, and immediately for Christmas I asked for one thing and didn't get it, and that was a second set of keys for my car. And then when I got home, I immediately locked my keys in my car and had to use Lyft to get here today. So I was like, I'm gonna sleep for like an hour, and I was like, where did I put my keys? Oh no, they're in the car, in the garage. But I had fun, and I always do better with class when I'm working on adrenaline. Actually, when Sue was asking me about ideas, one idea I have, and this comes up because I teach a class here and at other places about the Bible. I talk to people about why they should read the Bible, because it's not all the one thing, like a lot of people tell you. It's 66 books, or if you're an Ethiopian Orthodox person, they have 90 books, and almost none of them agree with the other ones. And it's cool to see how they interact or what's in there. People don't know what's in there. Once I teach that class, and I used to do it here for the confirmation class, and immediately after I did the class, kids and adults will come and say, I don't know where to start. What do I do? Okay, you're telling me to do this, but I don't know which book to read, and when I start, it's confusing, it's boring, it contradicts itself, and so this is like a starting place. I'm answering that question for anybody who's thought that. It's easier if you're in a Bible study because you have the momentum of the group to push you, but I hope this is something more for you and maybe a friend or two in terms of learning to read the Bible, and to read the Bible in a different way, so that, in a Bible study, I was in a Bible study for most of last year, actually Pastor Matt's Bible studies class. There might have been a few in here, and with Delaney, and it was great. We were all there, and sometimes you didn't have to read because somebody read, and all of that sort of stuff. This is going to be a little more individual. But I'm going to encourage you to do it with a friend too. So when I was thinking about it, I told Sue, okay, let's talk about resolutions for 2022, and let's talk about the Bible. Not that resolutions are for everybody. Calvin is not a fan. What are you implying? That I need to change? Well, buddy, as far as I'm concerned, I'm perfect the way I am. So who here did, just so I know, who here does resolutions or did resolutions this year? Anybody? So the vast majority of people, when they're asked by pollsters, say they did. Does anyone want to share what they had as a resolution? Okay, well, by the end of the class, you will have some. So this is an interesting thing on media bias. I don't generally like talking about media bias because as I was talking about with media confirmation, frequently media bias is people seeing what they want to see in the media, but this is an indication of it. This is the Economist asking people with YouGov what their resolutions were, and they didn't list any religion-related ones throughout. So everybody had ideas, health being the main one, but when an evangelical group asked the same question and included as number 2, relationship with God, it ended up being the second most popular thing, but it didn't appear in the other one, so no one ever said it. So it's how, when you ask a question, it drives the responses. And I wouldn't have asked the same thing. This is an evangelical group, so their focus is on relationship with God, but there's no discussion about social justice stuff in here, or understanding my faith better, or reading the Bible. It's my relationship with God. But when you see polls, frequently it's a good thing to ask what isn't included in the poll. And in this case, because you had 2 polls asking almost the exact same questions, you could see the difference between what they were saying. Reading the Bible in 2022. This is a question. There's a guy who was an evangelical. He's a leading scholar. He influences a lot of people. And he writes daily about the Bible, has a blog. And he is no longer a Christian, but he writes about the Bible daily, and he has a book coming up on the book of Revelation. And his thing is, he teaches at the University of North Carolina, and all of his kids are from the Bible Belt, and he frequently asks them who reads the Bible. They all do, but then when he starts asking them questions, they can't answer most of the stuff that he's asking. So, but his point is, it constantly amazes me that so many people who believe the Bible never actually read it. And I find that true here. When people talk about, when we went through the debate in the early 2000s about same-sex marriage, it was interesting to hear people here who had no idea what else is in the book of Leviticus start citing Leviticus. And so I would ask people, so what else do you like about Leviticus? The section on shrimp, what do you think of that? What about the one that says that you shouldn't wear two different fabrics of clothes? Do you agree with that? And people were like, well, I just know what I believe, and that's in there. That's in there somewhere. So it is interesting, people who don't read the Bible but say they believe it. But what's even more interesting to me is the way people read the Bible. And I break it down into three different categories, the most bizarre ones to me. One, I call it the Ouija board approach. And I grew up with this, which is, I went to a Pentecostal church for several years, and frequently it was felt that the Holy Spirit would guide you, and if you had an issue, you could actually just open the Bible and start reading and see if the Holy Spirit would guide you into reading and finding whatever. Generally, that doesn't work when you end up like in the book of Numbers. So you do to open toward the end of the book instead of the front. But that's one way. The more common approach, and I heard this, I went and visited my family in West Virginia, and I went to a Baptist service on Sunday, last Sunday, and I call it the jigsaw puzzle approach. And that is, you have a theology or an understanding of the Bible that borrows a piece from Genesis, something from the Ten Commandments, maybe something from Isaiah referring to the Messiah, a couple of things from Matthew, a lot from John, even more from Romans, and you put it all together, and that's what you believe. The problem is the preacher who was speaking on Sunday, it hit me as he was talking about sin. As he was going through, and he's citing sin in this section, I was thinking, sin in Matthew is primarily people who don't follow the law, violate the law, and Jesus is telling him what's important about the law. And they jump to Romans, and Romans is completely different to understand sin. Sin in Romans is actually something that should be of interest to us when we start talking about sin as a structural racism stuff, because to Paul, sin is a force, a large thing that can take control of us and make us do things that we don't want to do. It's not just an individual thing that you do. It's interesting if you read the first 4 or 5 chapters, 6 chapters of Romans, you start to get this idea of, sin's not, it's a very different idea. And then if he threw in Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy is completely different. Deuteronomy, again, is more of a corporate idea of sin. It's, if you sin, it does affect you, but it also affects your children, your children's children, and all the way down to the 4th generation. So not only is the sin itself corporate, but the implications are as well. So he was throwing this all together, and when you use this jigsaw approach, you lose the differences and the nuances between all of the different things. And what I think you come up with is, we've become a bunch of frazzled cooks. We have all of this different stuff that we're trying to put together, and it frequently doesn't work. So the thing that is important to me in terms of reading the Bible, and I've tried to tell this when I was teaching confirmation classes to kids, is what do we have? We have 66 what in the Bible? 66 books. But we don't read them like books. They're books. You tell people they are books. What other book do you read like we do on a Sunday morning 5 verses from, discuss them, and then shut the book.
72 if you're Catholic.
Right, and I said 90 if you're Ethiopian Orthodox. So yeah, it depends. And so those other ones are great books. I love Tobit, and some of the other books are amazing. And the Maccabees are wonderful literature, even if I don't think it's an accurate depiction of probably what happened historically. But very few people take the books of the Bible and read them like they do. I mean, who read a book over the break? I listened to, driving around, I listened to a book called The Lincoln Highway, which is a great book. It's 17 hours. I didn't stop after 15 minutes and say, okay, done, next book. But that's how I want you guys, when you're doing stuff, frequently even to sit down and to read it all at once. That's just, and part of the difficulty is, and I understand this, like if you take the book of Genesis, and try to read it all at once, it's very hard, because you might not know this, but Genesis is an editor who's taken the works of 3 or 4 different works and put them together and merged them into one. And he's trying to make sure that all of the information is included, and sometimes it's very redundant. And it's off-putting when you're reading. If you would just take the time to read Noah, the story of Noah and the Ark, it's actually 2 different stories that don't always agree with each other. So if you're reading it, you can read a passage and you start, you run into what animals are put in the ark. In one verse it says one thing, and then like 4 verses later it tells you something else different. So that one, I understand, is hard. But some of these other books I'm going to recommend to you are not difficult like that. So here's my approach, and some of you have heard me talk about my approach in general, but this is my approach that I'm going to recommend for you for the new year. The first one is to find a friend or 2. If you prefer to do this solo, that's okay, but it's best. I have a friend I have 2 friends who used to work at the Journal-Sentinel. One is an atheist and one is Catholic, who's fallen away. I talked both of them into reading the book of Deuteronomy with me. And they both thought this was crazy, but it's been an amazing, really wonderful thing that we've done together. So, and I would pick friends who don't always agree with you. If you have a friend who, when you say something to you, if you assert a point and you have a friend who says, well, I see it a different way, that's the sort of friend you want for this, okay? You don't want someone who always affirms what you're doing. I also had a book group. There were 4 of us. For 10 years, we read books that we had never read before. That was the rule, 2 rules. The books couldn't have been written in the last 50 years. So we started with Finnegan's Wake. That took us 2 years to get through, and then we moved through from there. But none of us agreed on most anything. And with Finnegan's Wake at the end, we invited a professor who's a specialist on Joyce, and he came and told us that most of the stuff that we thought we had agreed on and was right was completely off the mark. The second thing, and I get asked this a whole lot, is to find a good Bible. And it's important to know the difference between a translation and what's the living word is a not translation. Paraphrase. Paraphrase is great for understanding, but you have to understand that's someone's theology. They're reading it a particular way, and they don't really have to be bound by the words as much. So you have to be careful. So these are the ones I use, but I'm going to mention several others if you're interested in stuff. So I use the HarperCollins Study Bible. The New Oxford Annotated Bible from 2018 is good too. The reasons I like these are not primarily for the translations, but for the summaries at the beginning of the books. So if you get to the book of Mark and you're going to read this as a book, it's not a bad introduction. They're usually not very long, and then when you read it, they have notes throughout it. And don't get hung up on the notes very much, but if you do have a question, it's not a bad thing to look down at the bottom, particularly on your first run through, okay? What do you use as your personal Bible? Do you mind saying?
NRSV.
But what type of Bible? I mean, I have primarily NSV, but the HarperCollins Study Bible will have NIV, NRSV, and a bunch of others. But I say primarily the NRSV if you can, because all of them, even the translations have bias, and you can see the bias. I used to use this, but NIV made a change on it. In Romans 16, there's a person who's named as an apostle for years and years and years, was translated as Junius, which is a male name, but the name is Junia, which is a female name, but people who don't believe they're female apostles wouldn't translate it that way. Mm-hmm. And you can still find Catholic study Bibles that translate it as Junius because their theology says it can't be a woman. So the strategy now is to say this apostle doesn't really mean like capital A apostle, it just means messenger. So it's funny, the word itself was changed, and now that everybody's pretty much agreed on the translation, now the description has changed. But yeah, use NRSV if you can, but I'm going to give you some other options. And the annotated Bible, it's the notes are all from a guy named Michael Coogan. He's great, and he has a lot of interesting things. But there are a lot of Bibles out today. If you are interested in, there's Amy Jill Levine, who is an Orthodox Jew, has a New Testament now in which all the notes and the summaries are written from a Jewish perspective. So you can see what a contemporary Jew thinks of what Jesus has to say. There's a translation that's really good and interesting and provocative by a woman named Jennifer Rudin, R-U-D-I-N. It's just the Gospels. And you'll run into words and you're like, okay, that's, kingdom of God, that's what I'm used to hearing. I'm not used to seeing the empire of God. But it's the same term actually in the Bible. Empire and kingdom are the same thing. So when the Romans talked about their empire, created a lot of confusion because the Jesus people were talking about the empire, this alternative empire. So you had that out there. And then in the Old Testament, there's a guy named Robert Alter who has pretty much spent his entire life translating. He's a literary critic who spent his entire life translating the Old Testament, and is finally done after he spent more than 40 years on it. It's a great translation. The only funny thing is you will have on some pages like 2 verses and then the rest of the page is notes, because this is what he's done with his life. So those things are out there and they're good and helpful and interesting things to read. So, but
hey Dan?
Yeah.
Could you tell us what Bible you use, Pastor?
The New Oxford Annotated.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
what she uses in the New
Okay, I
Oxford.
missed that.
That's, and Michael Coogan's, I'm a huge fan of his stuff. He's the main editor for that. So HarperCollins, I just have found, for me, I like their short summaries of the books at the beginning, but you can find something else. But if you're just starting out and you've not really read the Bible much, I would say choose one of these 2 before you branch off into something else. 3, what I was just telling you, read the books like they're books for now. If you start one of the Gospels, if you can, maybe take it in like 3 or 4 days, or in 3 or 4 sittings. And then finally, actually I have one more point. Get a notebook to write out questions and thoughts, but don't get stalled while doing that. And I'll give you some examples of that in just a second. So write those questions and thoughts, but keep on moving. And then we had a men's Bible study group who used a commentary from the 1700s. And they were here, they did their Bible study for more than 10 years using commentary. The commentary was horrible, but they spent a lot of time on that sort of stuff. And commentaries frequently get you bogged down, and they're frequently addressing academic debates or issues that you might not care about. So the things that I recommend to people are college textbooks or surveys to answer some of the questions. Even if you took a survey class in school, it's not bad to get. Like John Collins at Duke, he has a great introduction to the New Testament. And if you run into something and you don't understand why there's a particular thing in the book of Numbers, he'll have probably something in there, maybe a little box that'll summarize. It won't go into great detail, but it'll be good. And I'm going to give you for the gospel somebody else. And it's a fortress book. Actually, Mark Allen Powell, who came and spoke here for 3 days, his stuff on the gospel is really good. But the introduction to the Old Testament, I mentioned Bart Ehrman. His introduction to the New Testament is really good at answering basic questions for the Bible. And then my recommendations for the year 2022 for you guys. One, start out simple. Don't take something that's a major book. Don't even take Genesis and start with it, because Genesis has, the first 11, 12 chapters are incredibly different from the final 12 chapters. The final 12 chapters have to do with Joseph, and it's a great little story in and of itself. The first 12 chapters have to do from everything from Noah and the ark to the Tower of Babel. It's just too much to take on. So instead, I recommend you start here, which is the book of Ruth, Esther, and Jonah. And read them just like they're short stories. Ruth is 4 chapters long, Esther a little bit longer, Jonah 4 chapters long. And the thing that you won't understand or won't realize is when you start, and most of us know the story of Jonah, but I think it's maybe my favorite book of the Old Testament, just because it is so incredibly radical, what's going on in the book. Because, the Jews thought they were the chosen ones, and the message of God was just for them. Well, the story of Jonah is saying, actually, the message of God goes not just to people we disagree with, but it's supposed to go to our enemies. And Jonah is the one who's responsible for taking the message to the people who've destroyed Israel. And, he resists, and who wouldn't resist at doing something like that? But it's an amazing little story. Ruth is a great story. I mean, I told you Jonah why it's great. I'll tell you the other two, if you read them, things to notice just right off the bat. Esther, at the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only book not included among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Does anybody know why? It's the only book in the Bible that God is not mentioned in. Yet at the same time, it's one of the most important books to the Jews. The holiday of Purim comes from it, and you don't want to be in Jerusalem on the holiday of Purim because it's Halloween for adults. People dress up and do all sorts of weird things, and everybody gets drunk. Well, maybe it's not a bad thing. But my daughter was there for Purim. She studied in Hebrew U for a semester, and she said, "Dad, what is going on? All of the Orthodox priests are drunk. It's lying around in the streets, and other people are dressed up like cowboys and Indians." And I said, "Yeah, it's a wild time. Americans decided correctly long ago not to celebrate like that for Purim." And then finally, the story of Ruth, which I don't know if you remember, Ruth is a Moabite. Moabites are horrible people. They're worse than the Samaritans in the New Testament. There are various verses in the book of Deuteronomy that carve them out and say these people are not okay. But it turns out Ruth is an ancestor of David. So it's like a rewriting of the history where the issue for Jews that's most important about the Bible is identity. For us, sin is the most important thing, and is at our forefront of our thinking when we're thinking about the Bible. For them, it's identity. Who is chosen, who is not chosen. Again, this story shakes that up a great deal because it inserts in the middle of the David story, David being the most important person in Jewish history, it puts a Moabite in the middle of the story. And if that's not provocative enough, the main metaphor in the story has to do with feet, and that's actually a euphemism for penis. So if you're curious about how that actually works, the only difficulty with that is, I mentioned this to a group before, and they were like, "So feet is always penis in the Bible?" And I said, "No." And they're like, "So Jesus was doing what with the disciples?" I said, No. He wasn't doing anything. Just in the story, well, there's a reference in Isaiah where there's another instance where this euphemism occurs too. It says an angel covers its feet when it's actually a reference to a penis. But in this story, the whole story turns on on that reference. So this is where I'd start if I were you. Something short, but you get the flavor of what the Bible's like, and you can read it in one sitting without much difficulty, okay? So I would start there, and once you get that done, then this is what I would do. And I've been wanting for 25 years to tell people at St. Mass to do this. I want you to read the Gospel of Mark. I want you to start at Mark 1:1, and in 3 or 4 settings, read to Mark 16:8. There are going to be some other verses after that, Mark 16:9 through 20, but I'll tip you off, those were added later because people are so uncomfortable with how the Gospel of Mark ends. So just sit down and read it and raise questions, write stuff down. This is interesting, this is not interesting. Get to know the author's voice and style, because the author of Mark is very, very dramatically different from the author of John. The author of John is a highly intelligent person interested in theological issues. The author of Mark, I don't want to say barely literate, but not a very well-educated person, processing and telling the story of Jesus for the very first time. No one had written a gospel, even though we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. People think Matthew's the first gospel. It's not. Mark is the first gospel. And in the end, if you guys are interested in this and you read Mark, what becomes interesting is Matthew and Luke both have Mark, and they borrow the framework from Mark and then tell the story using stuff from Mark. And in fact, they use the same words sometimes. That's how we know they were using it. That had in front, and the author of Luke said that there are a lot of stories of Jesus out there, and not all of them good. So he's critiquing what's going on in the Gospel of Mark. And in addition to that, they had a second source. It's called the two-source theory. They have in one hand the Gospel of Mark, and they're writing it and making adjustments, and parts of it that they don't like, they drop. Parts of it that they don't think were emphasized correctly, they elaborate on it, tell more. But then there's this other source that people call Q, which only Matthew and Luke have. And if you're interested, I can tell you all about Q. It's a great work. And the two of them, those are the only two who have it. And basically the stories of Matthew and Luke are taking these two different stories and retelling the story. But Mark is the very first time the story of Jesus is ever told. And we have it, and you get to read it. It's written around the year 68 or 70, so not long after Jesus dies. So get to know his voice and his style, and then ask obvious questions. These are a few of the questions that if you're reading it for the first time, I would like you to ask. Instead of asking the questions that you think you should be asking, ask questions that you would of any other book. Like, why does it start where it starts? If you're starting the very first gospel about Jesus, where do you think you should start? Well, we just celebrated Christmas. There's no Christmas story. It doesn't start with a Christmas story. The story starts when Jesus is about the age of 28 or 30 years old. And it starts with John the Baptist. Why are Jesus' disciples such idiots? Which is true from beginning to end. This is something that's actually that's really interested me for a long time, because they never get the message. You think by the end of the book they get it, but they don't get it. In fact, that's what's troubling about the book. They don't get it ever. And this is just a theory I'm working with, and I've seen a couple people allude to this, but I think the author of Mark knew Paul or had some connection to Paul. And Paul really, really, really disliked many of the disciples. And I think that influences the work that we have. But that's one idea. You might have another idea as to why it is. It's funny because we've heard such good things like about Peter, and if you read Matthew, Peter's a rock star, literally. But in the Gospel of Mark, he's not. And sort of exclude that out when you're reading the Gospel of Mark. Read Mark and see what he has to say about it. And then what is wrong with Jesus' family? Jesus' family in Mark 3:23 refers to Jesus as being crazy. They come and say, you know, something's wrong with him. We need to take him away. You know, there's some sort of, so there's that issue too, which is very different from the Mary that we just heard about over the Christmas story. Why does the book end so abruptly? If you read it for the first time, it should be disturbing to you, and it probably will be disturbing to you. And it was so disturbing that people in the early church rewrote 2 different endings to clean it all up and make it nice. And then finally, how many stars would I give Mark if I were reviewing it? Or read it and think, you know, you're reading it as a story. I don't want you to be, you know, sacrilegious about it, but do you think it works? Is it interesting? One other question I skipped over. Did Jesus have to die? And while you're mulling that over and thinking about it, another interesting question is, we've been taught that Jesus' death and resurrection is so important to our understanding and our faith. Occasionally it's good to look at the crucifixion from somebody else's perspective. From the Romans' perspective, why did Jesus have to die? For us, it has to do with sin and salvation, all that. It had nothing to do with that from the Romans. So why did the Romans feel the need to kill him? And if you have a good translation, they'll tell you the 2 people on their sides are not thieves, but are bandits, rebels, insurrectionists. So what is driving that whole thing? What makes, and did he, according to the author of Mark, did Jesus have to die? I mean, just think through that when you're reading through the story. And then finally, if you're reading one of the Gospels for the first time, Mark Allen Powell's book, Introducing the New Testament, there are a lot of other books out there, but his is, it's not long. You can find, I mean, if you're really interested, there's shorter ones. The Oxford has a series of very short introductions to things, and they're usually like 30, 40 pages long. But if you're just reading Mark, the Gospel of Mark, his section on Mark, he'll have a whole discussion of how the Gospels were formed, what Paul knew about Jesus and all that. But just take the section on Mark, or if you're reading Matthew, just take the section on Matthew. It's not long, and he'll raise some points that you didn't raise, and you'll read it and you'll be like, how did I miss that? But it's incredibly helpful in answering the questions that you might have asked yourself as you were going through the book. You might remember that Mark Allen Powell came and he gave a talk here about he had gone to the Soviet Union at the time and taught the story of the prodigal son, and he had gone to Africa at the time and told the story of the prodigal son, and he teaches in Ohio, and he talked about teaching the story of the prodigal son and how each of those groups interpret the story incredibly different from one another. If you're interested in that, that's in the book as well. I think we have a video of his presentation downstairs on that. You know, just one interesting thing, both the people in the Soviet Union and in, I think it was in there in the 80s, so before it was back to Russia, and in Africa, I don't remember which country he was in, maybe it's Tanzania, how critical they were of the communities. They thought when the son left, the communities had an obligation to help him out, whereas we focus on how he wasted his money and that sort of stuff, because that's how we approach those sorts of things. To them, they thought a person in need, the community has a responsibility to take care of that person. So, and they thought the father understood that the community had let him down, that he had not just let down his father. So that sort of stuff is interesting. He'll present different sorts of perspective on that stuff. So as I told you, I wasn't going to take super long for this class. Those are my suggestions. I'd like any feedback that you might have on this sort of, you know, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to endorse Pastor, and we do a Wednesday morning Bible class,
Right.
and there's about 25 people, something on that.
Which I think is great,
And
and,
then
I've been in Bible studies groups, and I've been kicked out of Bible study groups. And I think it's good. I think it's good because the value of it is the collection of perspectives. The only thing, one thing that I had a problem with large Bible study groups is people's expectations about what they're supposed to be reading or seeing in the Bible. And that if you're reading these things for the first time, you're gonna, and you're there with just one or two friends, you might see something that you might not expect, and you're not sure if it's appropriate. And actually, when we read Deuteronomy, somebody had a really, really radical idea about, we were talking about how does God come across in this passage, and the person held back on saying what they wanted to say, and I'm assuming if it's a small group, you might feel much more comfortable. But the person said, God strikes me as this abusive parent. That you would, in this instance, take away the kids and call Child Protective Services on him, based on the way he's dealing with the people in Deuteronomy. And that's, I think that's a perfectly wonderful and great reaction to have to that sort of stuff, because, too often we think we should respond in a certain way to the Bible instead of bringing, I always tell people, bring your entire self to the Bible. So when you read a story like in Judges where a particular woman is cut up into a lot of pieces and sent to a bunch of tribes, as in response to some horrible things that happened before, you should be outraged about that. That's terrible, terrible stuff. And that's who we are. We one thing that we have that nobody in the Bible has is a sense of what human rights are. And we have that. That's something that's developed over the last 200 years. We have a notion that humans have certain rights, and it's okay to have that collision from time to time about the Bible doesn't have that notion. So what happens when our idea about what justice is collides with what's in the Bible? I think it leads to conversations, because the thing to remember about the Bible is it's all about conversations. You have the story of if you do something wrong, who gets punished? Okay? And also the question of if someone is suffering somehow, did they do something wrong? Well, Deuteronomy has this idea, it's called the Deuteronomic Theology, which is that if you do something wrong, you will get punished, and all of your kids and grandkids will get punished. If you do something right, they'll be rewarded. Okay? Ezekiel says that's crazy. It should only apply to you. You're the one who did it. And then you end up in the Gospel of John, and the disciples turn to Jesus and say, this guy is he blind? Who did wrong, him or his parents? And Jesus says, what's he say? He says, neither. So you have this great conversation that's going on throughout the text and it's a wonderful conversation. It comes up into our current day. One of the most popular books of the 20th century was about when bad things happen to good people. That's exactly that same conversation that was going on in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy that's still going on today. And when my kids talk about karma, which is, karma is a big thing with children today, high schoolers and everything. What is karma but Deuteronomic theology applied to today? And that's just one example of the conversations that are going on. Jesus' arguments with the Pharisees are seen as the bad guys in the New Testament, but I try to tell people to look at them as not the bad guys. The thing is, they're so similar to Jesus that's why they're having the arguments. That's why we hate the Bears, because they're right near us. Why we hate the Vikings, because they're near us. We're so similar. Both, just in the last week, in the town of Magdala, which is where Mary Magdalene was from, they had found a synagogue. Actually, for those who have been to Israel with me, in 2012 they found it. In 2013 we went and saw it. They had just started digging it. Now it's completely out. Colors are still with it. And there are some representations of the temple that no one had ever had. Well, just last week they found a second synagogue. So the question came up, why in the first century did they have two synagogues in this one city? Which probably at most had 20,000 people. But there was this whole agenda going on, and Jesus was part of it, and the Pharisees were part of it. And that was to take ideas about purity and justice and say they don't just apply to the priests and the people in Jerusalem. Purity is important to us. So in the first century, you start finding these stone bowls, because before then, purity didn't matter as much. But then people started saying, these rules that God talked about back in Deuteronomy, they apply to us too. And the baths, the mikvaos that you go into, they're in people's houses in the first century. So there's like this democratization of religion that's going on, faith. The Jewish faith is being democratized, and the Pharisees and Jesus are doing it, and their debates are, how do we do it? Is it okay for us to pick wheat when we're walking through a field on a Sunday? Before then, that wouldn't have been a debate, because no one cared what the people in Galilee were doing. But at that point, people did care. So these are the discussions that are going on then. So to have an argument with what's going on in the Bible is frequently a good thing. But first of all, it shows the text is alive, and more importantly, that you are. Go ahead.
I agree that smaller groups sometimes they provoke better discussion. We've had one going here for decades on Monday morning.
Yeah.
And, you know, we'll read from the NIV, but we also read from the Message. The Message has been brought up a lot lately.
Yeah, the Message, it's good to read, but I'm not a fan. And I'm not a huge fan. I mean, if you want to see, I forgot my Bible, it's in my church, it's in my car. If you want to see where, I mentioned to you Romans 16, where the authors, where the translators of the NIV had to know that Junia was a woman, but because it didn't fit their theology, they ended up making a change, and everybody who reads it influences them. Another place where you have a situation like this, and it's not all over the place. Actually, in undergraduate school, I went to an evangelical college, and my professor was on the team of translators. I know these people, but in Exodus 22, there's a discussion about what happens if you hit a woman and she miscarries. So it's become an issue for debates about a fetus. If you do this, is the miscarriage, was that a baby or not a baby? Okay, I don't want to get into the whole discussion or whatever, but you can see why it's vexed. And the NIV has translated it, so instead of saying miscarries, they say comes to term early. That's not in the text anywhere. They'll put a note at the bottom that says miscarriage. If it's a translation, if you've got a Bible that's been translated sometime in the last 10 years or so, because so many people called them out on it. But they didn't change the wording still. So again, I don't want to get into discussion, but it's a case where their theology drove. And some people intentionally have their theology drive. There's an inclusive Bible that, you know, if the term refers to God as male, they believe that is inappropriate, so they'll translate it as just God usually, which I'm okay with, because I know that's their agenda and I know it's in there. That's the only thing with Bibles. I want to know if you do have an agenda where it's popping up. So, but I think it's fine. I would just, in that group, I would have an NRSV in there. It's probably the most reputable scholars did it, and it's a good thing to take the NIV and the NRSV and to put them up against each other. The thing with the Message is you just have to remember it's someone's theology. It's their interpretation of what's going on there. The other thing that I'm not a huge fan of, I think it's good, but I think it's overemphasized in Bible study groups, particularly large ones, is the emphasis on applying what the Bible has to say before you understand what it means. There's a cliche of understand what it meant before you understand what it means. Understand what it meant to people when it was written, and focus on that. Frequently, we had in our group on Deuteronomy, we had a lot of people who wanted to start talking while we were reading about the slavery sections. They all wanted to start talking about reparations and what's going on today. And we hadn't even really discussed what the slavery situation was then and what this text meant. and actually portions of the text that are a little bit difficult for us because the slaves, the Jewish slaves, or the Israelite slaves in Egypt, were wealthy enough that they owned slaves themselves. So how does that actually apply? I mean, it's just an interesting thing. I don't think it disqualifies you from making analogies and saying that a lot of stuff that happens there, because I think there's an interesting article in the current issue of Christian Century on the issue of reparations. The Egyptians end up giving gold and silver to the Israelites when they leave. And so what does that mean? Their understanding of what they should give to them. So I think it's good. I just think I'm cautious about jumping to that initially. And frequently with groups that I've been involved in or have even led, I'd say, okay, let's talk about what it meant, what it means today. But first, let's figure out what it meant back then when it was written. But you're right. It is a good Bible study group, and it's been going for a long, long time.
Well, you know, we try to read different versions, and that brings up more discussion. So your suggestion is probably well taken there as far as the version that you're referring, NRSC. What was it?
In our new revised standard version, in the 1950s, there was the revised standard version that was done, and then there was an update of it that's called the new revised standard version. Almost every passage that we read on Sunday mornings from the new revised standard version. Methodists, Lutherans, some Baptists, the vast majority of mainstream Christian denominations use that. It's evangelicals and mega churches that would use NIV, and I know NIV in general sells more than the others, and I think part of that is, in addition to the theology, they are better at, to get into the technical term a little bit, it's called dynamic equivalency is what you're doing. You're trying to write the language so it's dynamic but still equivalent to what the text means. And I think the NIV guys are really good at writing in a way that's understandable, and that, you know, when you're translating a word, you have this hard thing about how loyal are you going to be to what the word was, and how much are you going to make it understandable to the people reading. NRV people are a little better at this, whereas the NRSV people are better at what the terms originally meant. So.
You know, when you go back to older translations, King James pops in my mind. Is it more difficult to figure out what the theology and the agenda of the translators was as you go back in time? Or even thinking of Luther, for example, when he came up with the German translation?
You're talking about the King James and that sort of stuff?
Yeah.
The thing about the King James, you know, really good about the language in terms of it, you know, it just had its 500th anniversary a few years back. And I had no idea all of the phrases that came from that's made it into our language, and have become even cliches that they're used so much. The one thing you have to worry about, that you have to be aware of with the King James or with Luther, is a lot of texts have been discovered since the 16, 17, 1800s, or back to Luther's the 1500s. In particular, if you're talking about the Old Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovered starting in the 1940s. The texts there are the oldest Old Testament texts we have. Before then, the oldest text was called the Masoretic text, came from around the year 1000. Those texts at the Dead Sea Scrolls jump back another 1,000 years. So they didn't have those when they were doing the King James Bible. So there are things in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, a lot of them are very similar to what's in the Masoretic text. But in the Masoretic text, there's a very convenient 150 Psalms there. When you put together all of the Psalms that exist at the Dead Sea in the Qumran community, more than 150. There's some verses that were dropped out along the way in the Psalms. Jeremiah is a shorter version than what we have. People added on to it later on. So, so the thing is, we know more today than what they knew then about what the text was. So it's good to read, but also, again, to rely on a more modern translation to see what might have been learned or what is new as a result of it. Plus, well, that's the main thing.
So can I ask just really quickly, so churches that believe in God's word as inerrant,
Yeah.
how do they deal with that then? How do they deal with the, translations that are adding more information or changing the
Yeah,
language?
the hard thing is, that in addition to that, we don't have the original text. As I was just telling you, in the year 1900, the oldest Old Testament text we had of the book of Exodus was written in the year AD 1000, which would have been 2,500 years after the original text. Even in the New Testament, we don't have the original text of Mark. We don't have a copy of Mark. We don't have a copy of a copy of a copy of Mark. The earliest text we have is the Gospel of John in the year it's about from 130, but we don't have complete books of the New Testament then. So how do you get around this? It took a while, because first of all, the idea of inerrancy is a relatively new idea. The term inerrancy. What happens is society starts to be destabilized in the 1800s and early 1900s, and there's a lot of new knowledge. There's social sciences. The Darwin's ideas are coming. Freud's coming around. So how does the Catholic Church respond to this? They come up with a doctrine of the inerrancy of the Pope when he speaks on the issues of faith, and Protestants respond by saying the Bible's inerrant. But then other people start pointing out, well, what is the Bible? Are you talking about this or that? So the thing is, they have a tricky thing. They say that the Bible, not the Bible that you have, but the Bible in its original autographs is inerrant. The thing that's interesting about it is that you can't prove that because no one has the original autographs. So it's like having an argument in which you can't lose. It can't be, in terms of science, it can't be falsified. Maybe one day someone will get an original copy of the Gospel of Mark and you'll see where it ends. But that's so yeah, I had to sign a statement as a college student saying I agree that the Bible in its original autographs. And then I started saying, I signed that and I was like, what do I mean original autographs? First of all, it sounds like a baseball term. And then it was, so what you get then, for my undergraduate degree, I had to translate 1 Corinthians and the Gospel of Mark. And then I took classical Greek, so I had to do a Deonema on the soul by Aristotle, which was way harder than the others. But it's fun going through that. But what you get is you get a text. It's it'll be what a guy named Bruce Metzger, who's brilliant, but he's also not God, would say he thinks is the original text. And then you use that to translate and come up with whatever. And then he'll give you alternatives, like he'll say there was this other text that was different in the year 1300. And so you would do, and so what he's done on each passage that you translate from is assign a letter grade. What a professor. So you go through, and the highest grade, if it's an A grade, he says he is certain this is how John 1:1 started. But if he's not certain, and you get to Mark 16:9, he'll put a D grade on it, which means this probably isn't real. The funny thing is, he came up with this, and then there's this group called the Jesus Seminar, where they tried to determine what Jesus meant or whatever, and they basically came up with their own 4-grade system because they had red, which means Jesus almost definitely said this, and then pink meaning we think he said this, then gray saying we don't think he said this, and black meaning we definitely believe he didn't say this. All of these professors come up with grades on what's in there and what's not in there. But the fact is, we don't have the original text, Sue. So, but we've dreamed up these things. And there's one really good book on by a guy named I can't remember his first name, Jenkins, and he says there's some issues that the early church fought about so much that there's so many variants that you have no idea what the original meant. And the interesting thing is he wrote this book in the he wrote this book in the 1970s or 1980s in response to the issue of divorce. What did Jesus say about divorce? But the people in the early church were rewriting and making modifications, and Jesus in Mark gives no exceptions for divorce, saying you can't do it. And in Matthew, he gives one exception for porneia, which it's not really clear what that is. And then Paul has his own ideas, and to figure out what the original text is, all of these things have so many variants. It's really, really hard to know what. So Jenkins was trying to say, using that standard, I can't figure out what it really meant in the beginning. So I ended up taking 45 minutes. As you can tell, I like talking about this stuff. Any other questions or whatever? So if you do, one other thing I would suggest, if you do follow this, or if you take it up with the Bible study group, is regularly consult with someone who's smarter than you. Just if you know somebody who seems to know more about some of this stuff, or even if it's, one of the pastors or something, I used to email Pastor Gary first, and then Pastor Chris on things where I would run into something. I'd say, I can't figure out what this means, and then he'd write me back, and he would write me back and say, I'm better at photography than I am at theology. But it's a good thing, as I said. I think it's great, and I'm not telling you to leave your Bible study groups. Stay with them, because the more you know the Bible, nobody in here knows the Bible, because there's so much to it, and the more you can get involved with it is great. And it's also embarrassing because every 5 years a pollster will ask Christians what's in the Bible, and we all do horribly on each of those things. So it's you actually, maybe you can do it too much. Some people might say I do it too much, but and obviously I have a day job, but even if you balance it out by doing these things where you're reading the text like a story by yourself or with a couple other people, in addition to doing your own. The other thing is, you'll read a whole lot more if you're doing it the way I'm suggesting it. If you're in a Bible study group, it's going to take a little bit longer. We were supposed to do, in Matt's group, we were supposed to do Exodus in 4 months, and we were Exodus 12, and he was already taking the assignment at a new church, and we had to read massive chapters at one time. So that's what, again, I want you to remember, if there's any takeaway from this, remember these are books. The Bible is a book. It's, the canon, but these are books, and talk about them and discuss them and think about them as books, and if you can, read them as books. So, thanks a lot. Thanks for coming. As I said, I expected 5 of you to show up, so looks like about 200%.